For years, Laura Bennett had measured time by something that no longer existed in her daily life. Daniel. His name had become a locked door in her mind, one she rarely opened. She knew where he was supposed to be. Most importantly, she believed she knew that he could not reach her. Laura had moved to another state shortly after Daniel's conviction. She changed apartments, found steady work, and slowly built routines that belonged only to her. She learned to eat dinner without listening for another person's footsteps. She learned to sleep without wondering whether an argument would begin before morning. She stopped checking the windows whenever a car slowed outside. The scars were invisible, but they shaped everything. Daniel had once filled her life with promises, apologies, accusations, and sudden tenderness. His moods could change without warning. When he was angry, Laura learned to become quiet. When he apologized, she wanted to believe him. By the time his imprisonment finally separated them, she had become exhausted by the emotional storm. Prison, she thought, had finally put an ocean between them. On that Thursday evening, Laura sat alone in her small living room, a mug of untouched coffee cooling beside her. Rain tapped softly against the window while the television played in the background. She was scrolling through social media without paying much attention, moving past advertisements, birthday photographs, and harmless pieces of other people's lives. Then her thumb stopped. A photograph appeared on the screen. At first, Laura barely noticed it. It showed an ordinary family standing outside what looked like a suburban house in Texas. A man stood in the center, smiling beside a woman. Two children stood in front of them. It was the man's face that made Laura's breathing stop. She stared. The shape of his jaw, the crooked smile, the faint line above his left eyebrow, even the way he tilted his head toward the camera. Daniel. Laura's first reaction was denial. No, couldn't be him. She told herself that immediately, almost angrily. There were millions of men in America. People resembled one another. Photographs could distort faces. Memories could make strangers look familiar. Her hand trembled as she enlarged the image. The man's smile became clearer. Laura leaned closer to the screen. There was something else. His left hand rested against the woman's shoulder, and beneath his sleeve she could see the small scar near his wrist. Laura remembered that scar because she had once cleaned it after Daniel cut himself repairing a broken window. Her stomach tightened. She zoomed in again. The woman beside him was smiling. The children looked happy, unaware that the photograph concealed a secret. Laura looked at the name attached to the post. The location read Texas. The caption mentioned a family celebration and thanked everyone for coming. Laura's heart began pounding. She stared at the screen for several seconds, unable to move. Then, barely above a whisper, she said the name she had spent years trying to forget. Daniel. The room suddenly felt smaller. If the man in that photograph was really her husband, then the prison she had trusted to keep him away from her had not protected her at all. Somewhere in Texas, Daniel Bennett appeared to be living a completely different life. Laura's whispered name remained suspended in the quiet room, and with it came memories she had spent years forcing into the darkest corners of her mind. Before prison, before courtrooms and locked doors, Daniel had been the man Laura believed she would grow old beside. Their marriage began with flowers, late-night conversations, and promises that made Laura believe she knew him completely. Daniel could be charming when he wanted to be. He remembered details and knew exactly what to say when Laura was upset. But gradually, the tenderness changed. He began asking where she had been, who she had spoken to, and why she needed certain friends. Questions became accusations. Accusations became arguments. Daniel would apologize afterward, sometimes bringing flowers and promising that his jealousy came from love. Laura wanted to believe him. That was how control worked. It rarely arrived all at once. It entered quietly, disguised as concern, affection, or fear of losing someone. As the years passed, Daniel became more secretive. He guarded his phone, disappeared for hours, and offered explanations that never quite matched. Whenever Laura questioned him, he turned the conversation against her. "You don't trust me anymore," he would say. Sometimes Laura wondered whether she was the problem. Then came the night that changed everything. An argument escalated inside their home. Voices rose. Something crashed. Laura remembered Daniel's face, the fear in her own chest, and the terrible realization that the man standing before her was capable of crossing a line he could never uncross. What happened that night eventually led to Daniel's arrest and imprisonment. When the sentence was announced, Laura felt something unexpected. Relief. She had expected guilt, perhaps even grief. Instead, she felt her lungs fill completely for the first time in years. Daniel was behind bars. He could not walk through her front door. He could not demand explanations. He could not twist her memories against her. Still, relief did not erase everything. Laura carried guilt about the marriage, anger about the things Daniel had done, and a confusing attachment to the man he had once been. She hated herself for missing him. During the first years of his imprisonment, Daniel wrote letters. First, Laura read every one. He apologized. He blamed circumstances. He claimed he had changed. He described prison as punishment enough and insisted that he wanted only forgiveness. But contradictions slowly appeared. One letter claimed he had spent a day alone. Another mentioned speaking with someone during that period. His legal stories shifted. Stories he had told Laura before his imprisonment no longer matched what he now wrote. She began seeing the pattern. Daniel was still controlling the story from a prison cell. Eventually, Laura stopped answering. Years passed. Laura rebuilt her life, and Daniel became a distant fact. She believed prison was where he belonged. She believed she knew where he was. Now, staring at the Texas photograph, that certainty shattered. The smiling man on her screen was not supposed to exist outside those prison walls. Laura opened the photograph again, her fingers trembling. For the first time, she wondered whether Daniel's conviction had hidden a secret far larger than their marriage that she had never dared to consider before. And that question was about to lead her directly into the years she thought she understood. Laura stared at the photograph until her eyes began to ache. The question that had entered her mind refused to leave. If that was Daniel, who was the woman standing beside him? She returned to the social media page and began searching carefully. The woman's name was Rachel Morgan. Laura read the name several times. Rachel had posted the photograph herself, along with dozens of ordinary family pictures. There were birthdays, school events, holiday dinners, backyard gatherings, and photographs from vacations. In almost every image, the same man appeared beside her. Daniel, except the name attached to him was different. He was identified as David Morgan. Laura felt a cold pressure settle in her chest. She opened another photograph. There he was, standing beside Rachel while the two children held his hands. The younger child was laughing. The older one had his arm around the man's waist. They knew him as their father. That realization hurt more than Laura expected. She had spent years believing Daniel was imprisoned, while somewhere in Texas, two children had apparently grown up believing he was simply their dad. Laura kept searching. She found a neighborhood photograph showing the family outside a modest brick house. Another showed Daniel or David wearing a work uniform. There were pictures from community gatherings and school ceremonies. Nothing looked suspicious. That was what frightened her. Daniel had not been hiding in some remote place. He appeared to have built an ordinary, respectable life. Laura searched the name David Morgan with the Texas location. Property records appeared. A house had been purchased years earlier by David and Rachel Morgan. The purchase date made her hands go cold. It was during the period when Laura believed Daniel was still behind bars. She checked the date again, then again. Her breathing became shallow. Maybe there was another David Morgan. Maybe the face was an impossible coincidence. Laura wanted desperately to believe that explanation, but the evidence continued accumulating. A public photograph showed the same crooked smile. Another revealed the faint scar near his wrist. A family post mentioned a wedding anniversary. The date was several years old. Laura opened it. Rachel had written a loving message about the man who had stood beside her through every difficult season. Beneath the words was a photograph of Rachel and David dressed formally, smiling beneath warm lights. Laura recognized the suit. She remembered Daniel wearing it. She remembered the night he had bought it. Her fingers went numb. The anniversary photograph had been taken while Daniel was supposedly serving his sentence. Laura pushed back from the desk and stared into the darkness beyond the window. This was no longer about a stranger who happened to look like her husband. The timeline was impossible. Daniel had not merely vanished from her life. He had apparently been living another one. Somewhere inside that second life was the explanation Laura needed. But finding it meant discovering how Daniel had escaped the prison she believed had held him. Laura sat motionless, listening to the refrigerator hum. She wrote down every detail. Rachel Morgan, David Morgan, the Texas address, the children's names, and the anniversary photograph. Then she printed the picture. Holding it beneath the lamp, Laura studied Daniel's face. There was no mistaking him. The man she thought was serving a sentence had been standing in Texas, smiling for a camera, building memories with people who had no idea Laura existed. She needed answers. Laura needed answers, but she knew she could not uncover them alone. The next morning, she contacted the authorities and explained what she had discovered. She expected disbelief. Instead, the officer who reviewed Daniel's information became unusually quiet. His records showed that Daniel Bennett had been incarcerated. But when the officer compared the dates, something was wrong. Several documents did not fit together. The official timeline appeared complete at first glance, yet certain entries contained gaps. Transfers that should have been documented were missing supporting records. Some information carried dates that conflicted with other files. Laura felt the room around her become strangely distant. "Are you saying he wasn't there?" she asked. The officer paused. "I'm saying the records require further review." That answer frightened her more than a simple denial would have. For years, Laura had trusted one fact above everything else. Daniel was in prison. Now even that fact seemed unstable. After the call, she returned to the photographs spread across her dining table. She placed Daniel's prison information beside the Texas images and began building a timeline. The first year appeared normal. Then small gaps emerged. There were periods when Laura had received no letters. There were months when Daniel's explanations had seemed unusually vague. She remembered one letter in which he complained about being moved, followed weeks later by another claiming he had never left the original facility. At the time, she had dismissed the contradictions. Now they looked different. Laura contacted someone who had known Daniel before his arrest. His name was Marcus Reed, a former coworker who had disappeared from Laura's life after the trial. Marcus agreed to speak with her, though his hesitation was obvious. When Laura showed him the Texas photograph, Marcus stared at it for several seconds. "That's him," he finally said. Laura's stomach tightened. "Did Daniel ever talk about leaving?" Marcus looked away. "Once. He said that if he ever got the chance, he'd start over somewhere nobody knew his name." Laura remembered hearing similar words years earlier. Marcus continued, saying Daniel had talked about Texas as a place where a person could become someone else. At the time, it sounded like fantasy. Now it sounded like a plan. Laura spent the following days reconstructing every year of Daniel's supposed imprisonment. She compared letters, court records, prison entries, photographs, and dates from her own memories. The more she organized, the stranger the pattern became. There were missing pieces. Someone had apparently allowed the story of Daniel's imprisonment to remain believable, while another version of his life unfolded somewhere else. Laura stared at the timeline late that night, surrounded by papers. The possibility was terrifying. Maybe Daniel had escaped. Maybe someone had helped him. Or perhaps the prison records had been manipulated from the beginning. But there was another possibility Laura could barely admit to herself. What if Daniel had deliberately manipulated her into believing he was incarcerated? She looked again at the Texas photograph. If that were true, then every year she had spent feeling safe had been built on a lie. And somewhere in the missing years was the person who had helped Daniel keep that lie alive. Laura gathered the papers into one folder and wrote a question across its cover. Who knew where Daniel was? She did not yet know the answer, but she understood something else. Finding it would mean reopening the case she had spent years trying to leave behind. Laura kept staring at the question written across the folder. Who knew where Daniel was? For several minutes, she considered the names connected to his past. Then her attention returned to Rachel Morgan. Until now, Rachel had been a stranger in a photograph, the woman standing beside the man Laura had once called her husband. But the more Laura studied the family's pictures, the more one question troubled her. What did Rachel actually know? At first, Laura's anger was immediate. She imagined Rachel sharing the home that should never have existed, celebrating anniversaries with Daniel, and raising children beside him while Laura had spent years believing he was locked away. Every photograph seemed like an insult. Laura wanted to believe Rachel had known everything. That would have made the situation simple. But nothing about Daniel was ever simple. Laura began researching Rachel's background. She found an old social media account, employment information, photographs from before her relationship with Daniel, and comments from friends who had known her for years. There was no obvious connection to Laura. There was no evidence Rachel had searched for Daniel's real name. More importantly, the timeline told a different story. Rachel appeared to have met Daniel years after his supposed imprisonment. In the photographs from their early relationship, he introduced himself as David Morgan. His posts described him as a divorced man who had survived a difficult marriage and wanted a quiet future. Laura felt a familiar chill. That was exactly the kind of story Daniel would tell. He had always known how to make himself sound wounded while hiding the damage he caused others. Laura found a photograph from Rachel's early birthday celebration. Daniel had written a message describing Rachel as the person who had helped him heal after a painful past. Laura almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. He had transformed himself into the victim. He had never told Rachel that another woman was still legally connected to him. He had never mentioned Laura's name. He certainly had not told her that he was supposed to be serving a prison sentence. The discovery changed something inside Laura. For the first time, she stopped looking at Rachel as the woman who had stolen her life. Rachel had not stolen anything. She had been given a manufactured version of reality. Laura knew exactly how convincing Daniel could be because she had once believed him too. She remembered how easily he could turn a lie into a story, then make anyone questioning it feel cruel for asking. The realization hurt. Rachel might not be Daniel's accomplice. She might be another victim. Laura opened one final photograph. Rachel was sitting beside Daniel at a family dinner, smiling without suspicion. Laura studied her face. There was no triumph there, only trust. And suddenly Laura understood that if she wanted the truth, confronting Rachel might be more important than accusing her. She needed to know what Rachel was told. She needed to know who Daniel claimed to be. Most of all, she needed to know whether Rachel had seen the man behind the false identity. Laura picked up her phone. Her finger hovered over Rachel's profile. Then she sent a message. There was no accusation, only a request to talk. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the screen changed. Rachel had seen the message. Laura held her breath, unaware that Rachel's response would force both women to confront the same man. Rachel agreed to meet the following afternoon at a small cafe away from her neighborhood. Laura arrived early, choosing a table near the window. She kept the printed photograph inside her bag, along with copies of the records she had collected. When Rachel entered, Laura recognized her immediately. For 1 second, neither woman spoke. Then Rachel sat down and looked directly at her. "You're Laura." Laura nodded. Rachel's expression hardened. "Why are you contacting me?" Laura expected fear. Instead, she saw anger. "I could ask you the same thing," Laura replied. Rachel frowned. "I don't know what you mean. You're married to my husband." The words landed between them like a physical blow. Rachel stared at her. Then she shook her head. "That's impossible." Laura removed the photograph and placed it on the table. Rachel looked at it, then back at Laura. "David is my husband. His name is Daniel Bennett." Rachel's face drained of color. For several seconds, the sounds of cups and conversations around them seemed impossibly loud. "You're lying," Rachel whispered. Laura almost answered angrily, but stopped. She remembered saying those same words to herself the first night she saw the photograph. "I wish I were." Rachel pushed the photograph away. You have no right to come into my life and accuse my husband. I spent years believing he was in prison. Rachel stared at her. What prison? Laura watched the disbelief spread across Rachel's face. Daniel was convicted years ago. Rachel's hands began trembling. He told me he was divorced, she said. He told me he was trapped in a terrible marriage, Laura answered. Rachel looked down. He said his ex-wife was unstable. Laura felt the familiar sting of Daniel's old accusations. He told me my family was the reason he suffered. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. Laura slowly opened her folder. There were copies of court records, old photographs, addresses, and dates. Rachel examined each page while her expression changed from anger to confusion, then horror. I don't understand, she whispered. Neither did I. They began comparing their memories. Daniel had used different names, but his stories followed almost identical patterns. He described himself as misunderstood, betrayed, and desperate for a fresh beginning. With Laura, he claimed Rachel was simply a stranger from his future. With Rachel, Laura had apparently been erased completely. Then Rachel revealed something else. Daniel had several phone numbers. Laura had believed she knew his only number. Rachel knew a different one. Their email addresses were also separate. So were bank accounts and financial arrangements. Laura realized Daniel had constructed compartments, keeping each part of his life isolated from the others. Rachel covered her mouth. He made me believe everything was normal. Laura looked at her. He made me believe the same thing. The anger between them slowly weakened. For the first time, neither woman was looking at the other as an enemy. They were looking at each other as witnesses. Rachel finally reached across the table and touched the folder. If he lied about this, she said quietly, what else has he lied about? Laura looked toward the rain-covered window. That, she answered, is what we have to find out. They left the cafe together, still frightened and still uncertain, but no longer alone. Neither woman trusted the other completely yet, but both understood that silence would only protect Daniel. For the first time, they were ready to compare every lie he had ever told them. Behind them, Daniel's carefully separated worlds had begun to collide. And somewhere inside those worlds was a secret neither woman was prepared to uncover. The uneasy alliance formed in the cafe became something neither woman had expected. Cooperation. Laura and Rachel began comparing everything they knew about Daniel, starting with the years that were supposed to have been impossible. They created a timeline across Laura's dining room wall. Prison dates went beside letters, financial records, phone numbers, and photographs from Texas. At first, the gaps looked accidental. Then patterns began appearing. Daniel had received privileges that did not make sense for an inmate with his history. He had access to communications that were supposed to have been restricted. Certain visits had been recorded, yet the visitors' names were missing from later summaries. Rachel stared at the documents. Someone was helping him. Laura nodded. But who? Their answer came from an unexpected source. A former prison employee named Harold Price agreed to meet them after Rachel contacted him through an old professional network. Harold had worked at the facility during Daniel's incarceration. He was reluctant to speak, but when Laura showed him Daniel's photograph, his expression changed. I remember him, Harold said. He explained that Daniel had been given unusual responsibilities and occasional access to areas most inmates could not enter. More troubling, Daniel had somehow maintained communication with a person outside the prison using channels that Harold believed should have been monitored. Did you ever see who he was contacting? Laura asked. Harold shook his head. Not clearly, but I remember Daniel saying someone owed him. The statement left both women uneasy. Their investigation moved into financial records. Transfers connected Daniel to accounts that had no obvious relationship to his prison identity. Small payments eventually led toward Texas. Some were routed through intermediaries before reaching accounts associated with David Morgan. Then they found documents. Employment records, identification papers, and financial forms had been created under Daniel's false identity. Several contained signatures that looked almost identical to his. Rachel felt sick. "He didn't just disappear," she said. "No," Laura replied. "He prepared." But the most disturbing discovery came from an old message preserved in an archived account. Daniel had written that he could not allow a particular person from his past to find him. There was no name, only a warning. Someone knew something about Daniel. Someone had apparently threatened to expose him. Laura read the message twice. "This wasn't about starting over," she said. Rachel looked at her. "Then what was it about?" Neither woman had an answer. They searched older records and found references to an unresolved incident connected to Daniel before his imprisonment. The details were incomplete, but one name appeared repeatedly in notes that had never made it into the official narrative. Laura felt the same cold sensation she had experienced when she first saw the Texas photograph. Daniel had not simply wanted another family. He had been running from something, and if he had gone to such extraordinary lengths to disappear, whatever he feared must have been serious enough to destroy the life he had built in Texas. For Laura, that possibility was terrifying. She had believed the conviction explained everything. Now it seemed the conviction might have been only one piece of a much larger story, one Daniel had carefully buried beneath years of lies and manufactured identities. Rachel closed the folder. "We need to find out who that person was." Laura looked at the evidence covering the table. "Yes," she said, "because that person may be the only one who knows why Daniel really ran." Neither woman realized that finding the answer would force them to revisit the crime that had sent Daniel to prison in the first place. The question of who Daniel feared led Laura back to the beginning. She and Rachel reopened the records surrounding his conviction, refusing to accept the official story at face value. Laura remembered the night as a violent collapse of her marriage. Daniel had argued with her, accused her of hiding money, and demanded answers about people she barely knew. When the confrontation became physical, police arrived, and Daniel was eventually convicted. But now the old records looked different. A financial account connected to Daniel showed transfers Laura never knew about. Money had moved between Daniel and another woman named Melissa Grant, whose name appeared in several documents from the months before his arrest. Laura stared at the records. Who was she? Rachel searched the name and found something worse. Melissa had disappeared shortly before Daniel's arrest. There was no confirmed explanation for where she had gone. Laura's stomach tightened. Daniel had never mentioned Melissa, yet the financial records suggested they had shared more than a casual connection. They returned to that night. Laura remembered Daniel coming home late. He was nervous, angry, and unusually careful with his words. He told her someone had been threatening him and insisted that if police asked questions, she should say nothing about the money. Then he gave her another instruction. If they ask, tell them everything was mine. Laura had interpreted the statement as another attempt to control her. Now she understood it differently. Daniel was protecting himself. That night, Laura had found an envelope hidden inside Daniel's desk. Before she could open it, Daniel entered the room. He grabbed it from her and accused her of stealing from him. The argument escalated. Laura remembered shouting. She remembered Daniel pushing past her. She remembered something breaking against the floor. Most of all, she remembered Daniel telling her that nobody would believe her if she spoke against him. After his arrest, Daniel repeated a carefully constructed version of events. He portrayed Laura as emotionally unstable and claimed she had become obsessed with money and jealousy. Laura, exhausted and frightened, accepted part of the blame. She had believed that perhaps her silence would protect everyone. Years later, the missing pieces began fitting together. Rachel discovered that Melissa had once threatened to expose Daniel's financial dealings. An archived message from Melissa contained a warning that she knew about money Daniel had taken and intended to tell someone. Then came hidden evidence. Inside an old storage record connected to Daniel's property, investigators found a digital backup containing photographs and documents from the months before his arrest. One image showed Daniel meeting her. Another showed the same envelope Laura remembered. But the final file changed everything. It was a recording of Daniel speaking to someone shortly before the confrontation. His voice was unmistakable. He admitted that Laura knew nothing about the money and that he needed to make the situation appear as though she had caused it. Laura listened in silence. For years, she had carried shame over that night. She had believed her actions helped destroy Daniel's life. Now she understood that he had deliberately shaped the story around her. The truth devastated Laura deeply. She never imagined this possibility before. Daniel's imprisonment had not been the simple consequence of a marital argument. It had been the aftermath of a much larger deception involving money, Melissa, and a disappearance that remained unexplained. Laura closed her eyes. The man she had thought was imprisoned for what happened between them had been hiding something far darker. Somewhere in the evidence was the answer to Melissa's fate, and why Daniel had disappeared. Daniel noticed the change before Rachel admitted it. She no longer accepted his explanations without questions. She watched him when he answered his phone. She noticed how quickly he closed his laptop and how often he stepped outside to take calls. The man who had once seemed calm and affectionate was becoming restless. He checked the locks repeatedly. He began asking Rachel where she had been and who she had spoken with. When she mentioned Laura, his expression hardened. "She is trying to destroy us," he said. Rachel studied him. "You told me she was nobody." Daniel paused. "She is unstable. She has been obsessed with me for years." The words sounded familiar. Too familiar. Rachel remembered Laura saying that Daniel had once accused her of being unstable whenever she questioned him. Suddenly, the same phrases were coming from his mouth again. Daniel noticed her silence. "Rachel, you have to trust me." For years, that sentence had worked. Now it frightened her. Meanwhile, Laura continued working with investigators. The evidence connecting Daniel to his false identity was growing stronger. Financial transfers, communications, prison records, and the old files surrounding Melissa were being examined. Every new discovery narrowed the distance between Daniel and the truth. In Texas, Daniel felt that pressure without knowing exactly where it was coming from. He began sleeping poorly. He stopped leaving the house unless necessary. He checked his messages repeatedly and deleted conversations that might connect his past to his present. Rachel noticed everything. One evening, she found him standing in the hallway, staring at the children as they watched television. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Daniel turned. "Nothing." But Rachel knew him well enough to recognize the fear behind his eyes. Later, she searched through an old box of documents and found identification papers carrying the name Daniel Bennett. Her hands shook. The man her children called Dad had another name, another wife, another life, and possibly another crime. Daniel entered the room unexpectedly. Rachel quickly closed the box. He stared at her. "What are you doing?" She swallowed. "Looking for answers." His face changed. "You don't need answers." That was the moment Rachel understood that she was no longer protecting her marriage. She was protecting her children from a man who had built their entire family on deception. Still, exposing him terrified her. If Daniel was capable of lying for years, what would he do when he realized she was helping Laura? The next morning, Rachel secretly contacted Laura. She told her about the documents and admitted that Daniel's behavior had become frightening. Laura listened carefully. "Rachel, don't confront him alone." Rachel looked toward the doorway. "I think he already knows." Across town, investigators prepared to move forward with the evidence they had gathered. Then Daniel received a message from an unknown number. Contained only one sentence. "We know who you really are." He stared at the screen. For the first time since building his second life, Daniel understood that someone close to him had opened the door to his past. He looked toward Rachel and realized his carefully constructed life was beginning to collapse. He checked the windows, then the doors, suddenly aware that every ordinary detail around him could become evidence. The house that once represented safety now felt like a trap. Rachel's silence no longer reassured him. It warned him. Somewhere, someone was talking, and Daniel knew exactly what that could mean for him. By morning, authorities knew exactly where Daniel was living, and Laura knew she would finally have to face him. The Texas house stood in a quiet neighborhood, behind a trimmed lawn and brick walkway. Nothing looked threatening. Children's bicycles rested near the garage. Through the windows, Laura could see traces of the ordinary family life Daniel had built while she believed he was imprisoned. She remained in the car, staring at the house. Rachel sat nearby with the children, keeping them away from the immediate confrontation. Investigators approached the front door first. Daniel opened it himself. For 1 second, his face showed shock. Then it disappeared. "Can I help you?" he asked calmly. An investigator identified himself and explained why they were there. Daniel listened. Then he smiled. "You have the wrong person." Laura stepped forward. Daniel looked at her. "Laura," he finally said. Hearing her name from his mouth nearly broke her composure. "You're supposed to be in prison," she said. Daniel sighed. "I think you've been misled." He explained that his name was David Morgan and Laura had mistaken his identity. The calm voice he used could not hide the tension tightening his jaw. Nobody believed him anymore, not even Rachel. For several minutes, he remained remarkably controlled. Then investigators began presenting evidence. First came the photographs, then the financial records, then the documents connecting David Morgan to Daniel Bennett. Each piece weakened his story. "That doesn't prove anything," he said. An investigator placed another document before him. Daniel stared at it. The signature was his. Rachel stood several feet away, holding the children's hands. She watched the man she had trusted for years struggle to explain a life that could no longer be explained. "Tell me the truth," she said. Daniel turned toward her. "Rachel, listen to me." "No." Her voice shook. "You lied to me." Daniel looked frustrated rather than ashamed. "I was trying to protect this family." Laura heard the words and felt something inside her go cold. There it was again. The same excuse. The same manipulation. Daniel wasn't apologizing for what he had done. He was defending the reasons he believed his lies were necessary. Laura had once imagined this moment differently. She had imagined shouting at him, demanding answers, perhaps finally seeing fear in his eyes. Instead, she saw something more painful. He was worried about losing Rachel. He was worried about the children. He was worried about the house, the reputation, the comfortable life he had created. But he never asked Laura how she had survived the years he had deceived her. He never apologized for the fear. He never mentioned the nights she had spent believing he was safely behind bars. Laura stared at him and understood that the man before her had not changed. The prison sentence had not transformed him. It had only interrupted him. Daniel looked toward Rachel. "Please," he said, "don't let them destroy our family." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "You destroyed it," she whispered. The words silenced him. Laura looked at the children, then back at Daniel. For years, she had believed prison was the end of Daniel's control. Now she realized the truth. His greatest punishment was not losing his freedom. It was losing the second identity he had spent years constructing. As authorities moved forward, Daniel's carefully built world began collapsing around him. And Laura knew the next battle would not happen on a quiet Texas street. It would happen where every lie would finally be placed under oath. The courtroom battle began after Daniel's arrest, but for Laura it felt as though the past had finally caught up with the present. Investigators had uncovered far more than a false name. Daniel had maintained separate accounts, identities, phone numbers, and relationships. He had moved money through different accounts and used documents that concealed his connection to Laura. His Texas life had not been an accident. It had been carefully constructed. Every discovery strengthened the case. But evidence could explain what Daniel had done, could not explain what living with him had done to Laura. When she was called to testify, her hands trembled. She looked across the courtroom and saw Daniel sitting beside his attorney. He appeared older, quieter, almost fragile. Laura knew that appearance. She had seen it before. Daniel had always known when to make himself look wounded. The prosecutor asked her about the marriage. Laura described the gradual changes, the questions that became accusations, the apologies followed by new controlling behavior, the way Daniel made her doubt her own memory. She explained how he convinced her that keeping quiet was safer than telling the truth. I started believing everything was my fault, she said. The courtroom became silent. Daniel lowered his eyes, but Laura continued. She described the night that led to his imprisonment and explained how she had carried guilt for years because she believed she had contributed to what happened. Then she told the court what she had discovered. Daniel had manipulated the story. He had hidden financial dealings, concealed another relationship, and created circumstances that made Laura appear responsible for events she did not understand. Rachel testified afterward. That testimony was harder. She had to explain how Daniel had entered her life as David Morgan, presenting himself as a divorced man with a painful past. She described his lies, his secret communications, and the moment she discovered that the husband she loved was legally married to another woman. Her voice broke when she spoke about the children. They love him, Rachel said. They don't understand what he did. Laura watched her and understood that Rachel was not destroying the children's family by telling the truth. Daniel had already done that. The courtroom became less about revenge and more about truth. Daniel eventually took the stand. He portrayed himself as a misunderstood man who had wanted another chance at life. He claimed Laura had exaggerated their marriage and insisted that his Texas identity had been created only because he feared being trapped by his past. For a moment, his story sounded convincing. Then the evidence was presented. Financial records contradicted his statements. Documents contradicted his identity. Messages contradicted his claims about Rachel. Prison records contradicted his timeline. And the hidden recording contradicted his version of the original crime. One by one, the walls around his story collapsed. Daniel remained silent. Laura looked at him and felt something unexpected. Not hatred, not victory, only exhaustion. She understood that no verdict could return the years she had lost. No sentence could erase the fear, confusion, or loneliness Daniel had created. Justice could not give her those years back, could only stop him from taking more. When the proceedings ended, Laura walked outside without looking back. For the first time, she did not feel like a woman waiting for Daniel to disappear. She felt like someone who had finally stepped beyond his reach. Yet the truth still had one final cost. Rachel would have to take that truth home to her children and explain why the father they loved would no longer be coming back. When the courtroom doors closed behind Laura, there was no celebration waiting for her. There was only silence. Daniel had been punished, but Laura discovered that punishment and healing were not the same thing. For years, she had believed the hardest part of her story was knowing Daniel was imprisoned. Now she understood that the wound came from discovering that, while she had been rebuilding her life, he had been living freely. Some mornings, Laura woke expecting to feel relieved. Instead, she felt angry. She remembered birthdays he had missed, years she had spent believing he was behind bars, and moments she could never recover. She wondered how many times she had looked at a calendar and thought Daniel was exactly where he belonged while he was somewhere in Texas eating dinner with another family. The truth had changed the meaning of those years. Rachel faced another kind of pain. She had to explain to her children that their father had lied about who he was. She did not want them to believe that every memory they shared with him was false. She told them that loving someone did not mean accepting everything that person had done. Some questions had no easy answers. Why did he lie? Why did he have another family? Why couldn't he come home? Rachel answered as honestly as she could without placing adult burdens on children who had never asked to inherit Daniel's secrets. Laura and Rachel remained in contact. Their friendship was built from betrayal rather than trust and strengthened by a truth neither woman had wanted to discover. They rarely spoke about Daniel anymore. When they did, it was not with affection or revenge. Neither considered what happened a victory. They had both lost too much. Months later, Laura returned to a place connected to her old marriage. It was the street where she and Daniel had once lived, before the arguments, before the arrest, before prison became the word she associated with him. The house looked smaller than she remembered. She stood outside quietly for several minutes, remembering the woman she had been when she lived there. That woman had believed Daniel's imprisonment meant the danger was finished. Laura finally understood how wrong that belief had been. Prison had not been Daniel's greatest power. Her belief in prison had been. As long as she believed she knew where Daniel was, she believed she understood the boundaries of his life. She thought distance protected her. She thought a locked door separated his world from hers. But Daniel had never needed to stand outside her window to control the story. He only needed her to believe the story he had created. That realization was painful, but it was also freeing. Laura looked down the street once. She no longer wondered whether Daniel was somewhere waiting to return. She knew exactly what he had done, and she knew that his lies no longer belonged to her. The years were still gone. The memories would remain, but they no longer controlled her. As Laura walked away, she thought about the photograph that had started everything. A smiling man in Texas, standing beside a woman and 2 children, appearing to live an ordinary life. She had once believed the photograph proved Daniel had escaped prison. Now she understood that it proved something much stranger. Daniel had not simply escaped one prison. He had created another reality and convinced everyone inside it that everything was normal. Sometimes the person you believe has disappeared from your life has not disappeared at all. They have simply started living another one.